Now that we've got Aristotle's framework established that's going to sort of like build out everything that sort of comes after it, we're going to start looking at the contemporary literature within virtue ethics. But first, we're just going to look at a very, very serious worry for the view that basically threatens to undermine the entire project of virtue ethics completely by arguing that it just can't even be a proper ethical theory. It's this objection that's going to frame the rest of the discussion for this module, so we'll make sure to spend some time unpacking it. So just a quick recap. Remember, virtues are things that we have. It's not just ways that we act or ways that we, even tend to act. It's a way that of sort of being. It's a character trait that you have. And, honest people will tend to have like honest friends and will tend to tell the truth. But it's a lot more than that, because you could tend to tell the truth without necessarily being an honest person. If, for example, you're worried about getting caught in a lie or something like that. Remember, too, virtues can come in degrees, right? Your circumstances can affect, your capacity for eudaimonia. And phronesis, practical wisdom, is that that goes along with what a virtue is to make it a virtue. It is how you act virtuously, how you are a virtuous person. It's also important to keep in mind, and this will become a really big kicker later, nobody's perfectly virtuous, right? We are all going to have flaws of some kind or another. Now, we can talk about a continent person versus a virtuous person. A continent person is somebody who, they are controlling themselves enough to act in accordance with virtues. They are praiseworthy for doing that, but they are not genuinely virtuous. Once we get here, that their feelings are they already want to do what the virtuous thing is. Now we've got a virtuous agent. So continence is in that direction, but it is not itself, pure virtue. So just some kind of key things to keep in mind that are going to come up in a little bit. Here is where the revival of virtue ethics comes around with this paper in 1958 titled Modern Moral Philosophy. One of the hardest papers I've ever had to work through. Elizabeth Anscombe is the author of it, and in that she was found problems with both deontology and consequentialism, and it's these problems that ended up motivating a renewed interest in virtue ethics within the contemporary literature. And so even though virtue ethics is hands down the oldest of the big three ethical theories that we've talked about by thousands of years, this recent revival is what's going to be our focus for the rest of the module. Now this paper, right, so you've got this 1958 paper, and it starts to remotivate interest in virtue ethics, and then you start to get that interest developing in the 60s and 70s, and in philosophy time, that might as well be last week. There just hasn't been a lot of time for, these theories to fully develop like we've seen with consequentialism and deontology. I mean, there are some very robust, very cool virtue ethical theories out there, but, we just won't have enough time really to dive into that kind of stuff. Instead, we're just going to take this sort of broad approach and look at a serious objection to the virtue ethical project here. And really, what we're going to be asking is whether virtue ethics can even hold a candle to consequentialism and deontology. So remember, these are the three parts of an ethical theory. Hopefully you've got this down by now: criterion of right, theory of value, decision procedure. And the question is, can virtue ethics give us this? it seems like it can definitely give us a theory of value, right? The virtues themselves, right, they're going to be irreducible and, they're going to be valuable for their own sake. Maybe eudaimonia is valuable and, virtues are just valuable in virtue of getting us there or something like that. Maybe we've got a criterion of right here. The right act is the one that manifests the virtues or, hits the target of virtue or, something like that. And, maybe we've got some kind of decision procedure in place. Here's the problem. It's not super obvious that virtue ethics is a normative ethical theory. This is what we're going to be focused on. Is can virtue ethics be normative? Normative, we've had this term, but it's been a minute. Normative just it means like what we ought to do. So its opposite, I guess, is kind of the word descriptive. So descriptive is just telling us what is the case. Oh, that guy is beating up that other guy over there. That's descriptive. Normative tells us what ought to be the case. Hey, he shouldn't be beating up that guy over there. You should intervene and go help. Right? Those are normative claims. And so a normative ethical theory is going to tell us what to do. Virtue ethics, even if it's got a clear criterion of right and a clear theory of value, it's not super clear what the decision procedure is for identifying right actions. Right? Virtue ethics is focused on agents, not on acts. And so how is it that this agent-centered theory can even go about telling us what to do? Because you got to be careful here. You can try to just like capture this notion of right act and come up with a decision procedure, but if it doesn't stay true to the virtue ethical ideal of focusing on agents, then it's not really virtue ethics anymore. And so it just... The worry here is that virtue ethics isn't going to be structured in the right way to be able to be a rival theory to consequentialism and deontology, right? Those clearly tell us what we ought to do. Those have, even if they're a little bit complicated, they have very clear decision procedures about what we ought to do and how to figure this stuff out. Virtue ethics is like, you need some phronesis, I guess, and there you go. Maybe the middle ground between two extremes, but it's like super contextual. So it's not super obvious that it's got a clear and forthcoming decision procedure. So this is the argument that we're going to be engaging with for the rest of this module. I'm just calling this the normativity argument. The conclusion is that virtue ethics can't be a proper normative ethical theory. Why not? Well, Premise 1 says that if it can't guide action, then it can't be a proper ethical theory. Premise 2 says that it can't guide action. So by modus ponens, what follows is, it just can't be an ethical theory. We're going to be looking at two philosophers, Julia Annis and Rosalind Hursthouse. Each of them is going to be attacking a different premise of this argument. We're going to start with Julia Annis, who will be attacking premise 1 in a really, really beautiful and interesting way that I think sort of brings Aristotle really back to the forefront in how he thought about these kinds of issues. So we'll look at Annis in the next video. I'll see you then.